On a cool Saturday morning of March 30th, 1963, two armed Secret Service agents knocked on the door of this house that stands here at 115 North Stratton Street. In a moment, a man named Jacob Sheads would answer the door. The Secret Service men, informed themselves that they were of a presidential visitation nature, and that the next day, Sunday, March 31st, 1963, Mr. Jacob Sheads, also known as locals here as Colonel Jacob Sheads, who was a former school teacher and historian and park guide. He was notified that he was going to give President John F. Kennedy a battlefield tour. They informed Sheads of the presidential visit, and they informed him not to tell anyone, including the National Park Service, the licensed battlefield guides, or even his own family. Mr. Sheads got in his car with these two men and took them on a rehearsed tour of the Gettysburg battlefield, which was supposed to begin at Seminary Ridge, take them down West Confederate Avenue to Little Round Top, the Devil's Den, the wheat field, and then finally to the high water mark of the Confederacy. He was given 3 orders from the men of the Secret Service. 1, he was not to tell anyone. 2nd, he was not permitted to allow the president to get out of his vehicle. And thirdly, the White House reporters that would be traveling with them were to be told that the president was very knowledgeable on the Battle of Gettysburg. This has been John F. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg, Part 1, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. To Gettysburg on March 31st, 1863, Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The party, including the president, left Camp David, which is about 16 miles to our south, and they drove the following routes: 77 east to 15 north to the Emmitsburg Road, which we're looking at here in front of us. They left in 3 cars. The lead car was a 1962 Mercury convertible with President Kennedy. The second car was the United States Secret Service, and the third car was full of White House reporters and photographers. President Kennedy drove himself here and went northbound on the Emmitsburg Road in the direction that car is coming in, until he got to this point here, and he pulled in to the Edgewood Bowling Alley, which still sits here today. And this is where he met his tour guide, Colonel Jacob Sheads. Jacob Sheads would get into the car with him. From here, they would proceed on their battlefield tour. So this has been Part 2 of John F. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg on March 31st, 1963, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be President John F. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and this video is going to be shot in car. Now, after leaving the Edgewood Bowling Alley, the president drove up the Emmitsburg Road toward the Cyclorama and the Visitor Center, the Cyclorama Center site, which would be dedicated later in the year. He passed several buildings, including the Alexander Curran's farm, which we're passing there on our left-hand side. He came through this small village up ahead where Emmitsburg Road is. It was called at that time, and it was near the end of it, it was called Pinchgut. And we did a video on the small village of Pinchgut. And President Kennedy was in the car with Colonel Sheads, and Colonel Sheads, as we got to this point about right here, began to explain some of the actions of July 2nd and July 3rd, no doubt, as the president passed this area. There is the Snyder House on the left-hand side as we go through what was once Pinchgut. And then, of course, over here was the view of the Round Tops and the George Rose Farm. So no doubt, as they passed down this road, the president was being entertained and guided by Colonel Sheads. As he would pass these historic properties, he would begin explaining what happened across this very road that they were riding on the afternoons of July 2nd and July 3rd of 1863. One thing he did definitely explain to the president was this road was used by the First Corps of the Army to enter Gettysburg, and then one division of the 11th Corps. And you can go back and watch our two video series, the First Corps arrival at Gettysburg and the 11th Corps arrival at Gettysburg, on our past videos. Now, as they passed the Sherfy Peach Orchard here and headed toward the Nicholas Corridori Farm, this is where the tour began to go wrong. When they arrived near where the old Cyclorama parking lot was, the old visitor center parking lot, Kennedy said he wanted to make a right. And of course, being the president, he wasn't going to be turned down, so Colonel Sheads basically said, "Yes, sir." They made a right and drove about 100 yards before turning onto Hancock Avenue, which is where we're going to pick up on our next video series. Now, here is the Daniel Klingel, the Klingel farm rather, that we're passing now. And then up ahead would be the site of the old Rogers farm on the left-hand side of the road. And then that red barn and the brick house up ahead would be the Nicholas Corridori Farm. And just after we pass the Corridori Farm, the next right you can make will be where the president made his right before entering Hancock Avenue and making a right when it was a two-way street back in 1963. Of course, we can't do that today because we would be driving in the wrong direction. But this is the route that President Kennedy, Jacob Sheads, the Secret Service, and some White House reporters took when they left Edgewood Bowling Alley on Sunday, March 31st, 1963, just about 100 years, just short of 100 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the route that President Kennedy drove his 1962 Mercury convertible in. And again, on the next stop, we're going to pass the Bryan Farm and the high water mark. We are now coming to the intersection where Kennedy exclaimed, "I want to turn right," and Colonel Sheads said, "Yes, sir." This has been part 3 of President John F. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg, part 4 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Now, we just came up the Emmitsburg Road and talked about President Kennedy and Jacob Sheads on their tour, and how they discussed different aspects of the battle during their drive up the Emmitsburg Road. When they got to the Emmitsburg Road, of course, in that last video, they turned here where you today see the battle theater and headed up this way. Now, the president got to this intersection right here at Ziegler's Grove, and as you can see, there's a sign that says no right-hand turn. Well, in 1963, this was a two-way street, and President Kennedy made a right here, which today would be breaking the law of the traffic here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. And he drove past the Bryan Farm and to the angle where he got out of his car. And when he got out of his car, he got out at the angle, and it was the first of 3 times that Kennedy would exit his car, as the Secret Service had asked Jacob Sheads not to allow him to do. As Jacob Sheads began to explain the actions of the angle, Pickett's charge, and the high water mark, a small crowd of onlookers began to form, in which the Secret Service then kept them at bay. Now the parties would then get back into their car and head south toward the Pennsylvania Monument, which we'll take a look at in our next series of videos, and they would eventually pass the 20th Massachusetts Monument, the Pennsylvania Monument, and they would drive on to Little Round Top. This has been part 4 of President John F. Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Round Top, and continuing in our series of President Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg, the president and the party got off and parked at the Little Round Top area and walked up this paved walkway here, up here toward the 91st Pennsylvania Monument, and they had stopped in front of this battery here in front of us, which is Hazlitt's Battery. A photograph was taken of the president and his party, and while he was standing here in front of Hazlitt's Battery, Jacob Sheads was explaining all the actions that happened in this direction down here on the battle on July 2nd, 1863. The actions at Devil's Den, the Rose Farm, the wheat field, and then on up here to Little Round Top. The photographer stood right where I'm standing now, and President Kennedy stood right in front of this artillery piece facing the north in front of this gun here. And I will post a picture of that picture that was taken on Sunday, March the 31st, 1963, of President Kennedy standing in front of this gun. Our next stop will take us through the Devil's Den, but this has been President Kennedy's visit to Gettysburg, Part 5, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.